What if the person you trusted to guide your faith, your hope, and even your future was living a carefully crafted lie? That is the unsettling question at the heart of the story of Pastor Lamar Whitehead, widely known as the Bling Bishop. For years, Whitehead stood behind the pulpit as a symbol of success: luxury suits, diamond jewelry, high-end cars. He presented himself as living proof that faith could lead to prosperity. To his followers, his lifestyle was not excess. It was evidence. Evidence that belief worked. Evidence that devotion paid off. Evidence that God rewarded loyalty. But beneath the polished image and confident sermons, a very different story was quietly unfolding. When federal courts finally delivered a guilty verdict, the illusion shattered. What appeared to be a journey of redemption was exposed as a pattern of deception that stretched back decades. The wealth so proudly displayed was not the result of divine favor or honest achievement, but of manipulation, broken trust, and calculated schemes. The man who preached transformation had never truly left his past behind. This is not just the downfall of a single preacher. It is a cautionary tale about charisma, power, and the danger of confusing appearance with truth. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How easily can faith be exploited? How often do we equate confidence with credibility? And how many warning signs do we ignore when someone promises miracles, success, and riches? In this story, we will walk through the rise and fall of the Bling Bishop, how he gained influence, how he maintained the illusion, and how it ultimately collapsed under scrutiny. The goal is not to attack belief, but to understand how trust can be abused when accountability disappears. If you value stories that uncover truth, challenge appearances, systems and explore the human cost of deception, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you deep, meaningful stories that matter. Long before Lamar Whitehead stepped behind a pulpit and spoke the language of redemption, his life was already shaped by a very different kind of ambition. When the image of the Bling Bishop began to circulate years later, it was often framed as the story of a man who had fallen, paid his price, and emerged transformed. Yet when we look closely at the years before his rise as a religious figure, a more complex and unsettling narrative begins to take shape, one that connects seamlessly to the illusion he would later perfect. In the early 2000s, Whitehead was not known as a preacher or a spiritual guide. He was moving quietly through financial systems, learning how identities could be borrowed, credit could be manipulated, and trust could be exploited without immediate consequences. What started as individual acts of deception grew into a wide-reaching operation that affected dozens of people across multiple states. Names were taken, credit histories were abused, and expensive purchases were made in the shadows, leaving victims to face the damage long after the transactions were complete. Luxury vehicles, particularly high-end SUVs, became symbols of his success during this period, foreshadowing the public displays of wealth that would later define his religious persona. As complaints accumulated, investigators began to notice patterns that could not be ignored. The same addresses appeared repeatedly, the same financial trails led back to one central figure, and eventually. So, the structure behind the operation was exposed. By the time authorities intervened, the scale of the damage had become undeniable. More than $2 million had been taken through identity theft and financial fraud, not through a single reckless act, but through a calculated system designed to maximize gain while minimizing visibility. When Whitehead was arrested, the image he presented to the world shifted abruptly. The confident figure behind the wheel of luxury cars was replaced by a man facing the weight of his own decisions. In court, the evidence told a story that words could no longer reshape. Victims described the confusion and hardship left in the wake of stolen identities, while records traced a clear line from their losses to his benefit. The sentence that followed 5 years in prison was framed by many as the necessary conclusion to a dark chapter, a point where accountability finally caught up with ambition. During his time behind bars, Whitehead would later claim that reflection and hardship had changed him. This idea of transformation became central to the story he told after his release, blending seamlessly into the religious narrative he would soon adopt. Prison, in his retelling, was not merely punishment but preparation, a moment of reckoning that cleared the path for a new purpose. To those who encountered him later, this backstory made his rise seem authentic, even inspiring. Yet when placed alongside what came after, these early crimes no longer feel like a closed chapter. Instead, they read like the foundation of a pattern. The skills required to manipulate financial systems, the confidence to persuade others to trust him, and the ability to maintain a convincing facade under pressure were not learned in the church. They were refined years earlier, during a period defined by fraud rather than faith. Understanding this part of Whitehead's life is essential, because it reveals that the transformation he preached may have been more about reinvention than redemption, a shift in costume rather than character. When Lamar Whitehead walked out of prison in 2013, he did not simply return to society as a private citizen trying to rebuild a quiet life. Instead, he stepped into the world with a carefully reshaped identity, one that appeared to offer redemption, purpose, and a higher calling. The past, marked by courtrooms and prison walls, was reframed as a testimony rather than a warning. In his own telling, hardship had refined him, and loss had prepared him for leadership. This narrative did not emerge by accident. It was constructed with precision, designed to inspire trust and invite belief. Whitehead soon positioned himself within Christian spaces, speaking openly about transformation and second chances. He presented himself as living proof that a person could fall deeply and rise again through faith. For many listeners, this message resonated. Stories of personal change carry powerful emotional weight, especially when delivered by someone who appears confident, articulate, and unapologetically certain of his purpose. It was within this environment that he founded Leaders of Tomorrow International, an organization that blended religious language with ambition and visibility. The name itself suggested progress, influence, and destiny, ideas that appealed strongly to those searching for direction or hope. As his presence grew, so did the imagery surrounding him. Whitehead did not adopt the appearance of a humble preacher. Instead, he leaned into spectacle, designer clothing, expensive watches, luxury vehicles, and public displays of wealth became central to his image. Rather than downplaying these symbols, he embraced them, weaving them into his message. Prosperity was not something to be questioned, it was something to be celebrated. To his audience, success was framed as evidence of divine favor, and wealth was portrayed as a natural outcome of faith properly applied. This approach drew attention quickly. In an era shaped by social media, visibility often translates into credibility. Whitehead understood this dynamic well. Photos, videos, and public appearances reinforced the idea that he was living the life he preached about. His confidence, combined with the polished aesthetic of success, attracted followers who believed that aligning with his teachings could unlock similar outcomes in their own lives. Faith, ambition, and material aspiration became tightly intertwined, creating a message that felt both spiritual and aspirational. Connections further amplified his influence. By aligning himself with prominent figures and appearing in public spaces associated with power and legitimacy, Whitehead strengthened the perception that he was not only accepted but endorsed. These associations gave his ministry an air of authority, making it easier for supporters to overlook unanswered questions or unresolved details from his past. The story of redemption was more appealing than the reality of scrutiny. What made this phase of Whitehead's life especially significant was how seamlessly it built upon what came before. The same confidence that once allowed him to navigate financial systems now helped him navigate belief. The same understanding of presentation and persuasion became tools in a new arena. From the outside, it looked like transformation. From a closer view, it resembled reinvention. Leaders of Tomorrow International was not just a religious organization. It was the stage upon which a new version of Lamar Whitehead was performed, one that promised faith, success, and meaning, while carefully controlling what the audience was allowed to see. As Lamar Whitehead's influence grew and his image as a successful spiritual leader became firmly established, the consequences of that carefully constructed persona began to surface in deeply personal ways. The message he preached was no longer abstract or symbolic. It entered the lives of individual followers who believed not only in his words, but in him as a guide they could trust with their futures. Among them was Pauline Anderson, a devoted congregant whose story would later become one of the clearest examples of how faith and trust were turned into instruments of personal gain. Anderson did not approach Whitehead as a stranger or an investor seeking profit. She approached him as a believer seeking guidance. At the time, she was facing financial uncertainty and struggling with the obstacles that come with limited credit and rising living costs. Whitehead presented himself as a solution, someone who understood both spiritual growth and practical success. He spoke with certainty about opportunities, improvement, and security, carefully blending religious reassurance with promises of real-world progress. To Anderson, his confidence felt comforting, especially because it came from a man who claimed to have overcome his own past through transformation. Over time, Whitehead persuaded her that a financial contribution could lead to a better future. The money, he explained, would be used in ways that would ultimately benefit her, whether through investment, support, or opportunities tied to his expanding influence. Trust was the foundation of every conversation. Anderson believed she was making a calculated decision, guided by someone who cared about her well-being. When she handed over her retirement savings, totaling $90,000, it was not done lightly. It was the result of reassurance, repeated promises. So this Sims asked, and the belief that she was placing her future in safe hands. The tone of the relationship changed once questions began to surface. As time passed and expectations were not met, Anderson sought clarity. Instead of transparency, she encountered shifting explanations. What had once been described as an arrangement meant to help her was suddenly redefined. The money, Whitehead claimed, was no longer something he was responsible for returning. It was now described as a donation, with a single change in language. Obligation. Legation disappeared, and accountability was replaced with dismissal. This redefinition was more than a technicality. It revealed a deeper pattern in how trust was managed and controlled. The same authority that once reassured Anderson was now used to silence her concerns. Conversations that began with empathy ended with pressure, framing doubt as disloyalty and questioning as misunderstanding. The power imbalance was unmistakable. Whitehead stood as a figure of spiritual authority, while Anderson found herself struggling to be heard. Her life savings suddenly treated as if they were never meant to be protected in the first place. What makes this story especially troubling is how closely it mirrors the image Whitehead had cultivated publicly. His sermons spoke of prosperity, uplift, and divine order, yet behind the scenes, the people who believed most strongly in that message were left vulnerable. Anderson's experience was not about reckless decision-making or greed. It was about trust placed in a leader who presented himself as both spiritually guided and practically capable. When that trust was broken, the cost was not only financial, but emotional. This chapter of the story fits seamlessly into the larger pattern already established. The skills used to persuade, redirect, and reframe responsibility were not new. They were refined over years and adapted to a new setting. In the case of Pauline Anderson, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Her experience stripped away the polished surface of success and revealed the human impact beneath it, showing how easily belief can be transformed into leverage when power goes unchecked. As the cracks in Lamar Whitehead's public image widened, investigators began to uncover a pattern that felt disturbingly familiar when placed alongside his past. The transformation he had spoken about so confidently no longer appeared to be a break from old habits, but an evolution of them. The stage had changed from stolen identities to religious institutions, yet the methods showed the same careful balance of confidence, persuasion, and calculated risk. What emerged was not a single mistake or misunderstanding, but a web of continued misconduct that unfolded quietly behind the scenes while his public persona remained polished and triumphant. At the center of these findings was the discovery that Whitehead had been attempting to secure large sums of money through questionable financial means. Bank records, documents, and communications revealed efforts to obtain loans using information that did not align with reality. Statements were exaggerated, paperwork was altered, and financial strength was presented as far greater than it truly was. These were not casual errors. They were deliberate moves designed to unlock access to funds that would sustain the image he had worked so hard to project. Luxury, after all, requires constant maintenance. As authorities followed the trail, They noticed how closely his personal ambitions were tied to the resources flowing through his religious organization. Church-related funds and influence appeared to blur with private interests, especially when it came to high-end real estate. Properties valued in the millions entered the picture, reinforcing the image of extraordinary success. From the outside, these purchases looked like the natural rewards of a thriving leader. From the inside, they raised uncomfortable questions about how such wealth was being assembled and who ultimately bore the cost. Further scrutiny revealed that pressure and intimidation were also part of the equation. Individuals who found themselves drawn into Whitehead's orbit described situations where requests for money came with urgency and authority. The line between persuasion and coercion grew thin, especially when spiritual standing and personal loyalty were quietly implied. What appeared outwardly as leadership began to resemble leverage, with influence used to extract financial benefit rather than offer guidance or support. The situation escalated when federal authorities became directly involved. During interactions with investigators, Whitehead presented himself as cooperative and transparent, yet evidence later showed inconsistencies between his statements and reality. Devices, records, and information that should have been disclosed were concealed or denied. These moments mattered, not because of their simplicity, but because they echoed a deeper pattern. Truth was flexible when it threatened the structure he had built, and honesty became optional when silence or misdirection offered protection. Each discovery added another layer to the story already unfolding through earlier chapters. The fraud that once revolved around financial systems had now embedded itself within faith-based authority and public trust. The confidence that drew followers and supporters also shielded questionable decisions from immediate challenge. By the time the full scope of these actions became visible, the contrast between the message and the behavior was impossible to ignore. What makes this phase of the story especially significant is how seamlessly it connected everything that came before. The luxury properties, the altered documents, the pressure placed on others, and the misleading statements to authorities all pointed in the same direction. They revealed a man who never truly stepped away from deception, only refined it. The investigation did more than expose wrongdoing. It stripped away the remaining illusion, showing that beneath the sermons, the symbols, and the spectacle, the same pursuit of advantage continued, unchanged in its intent, even as its setting grew more elaborate. In 2024, the story that Lamar Whitehead had spent years carefully shaping finally reached its breaking point. A federal jury delivered a verdict that left no room for ambiguity, finding him guilty of multiple crimes and bringing his public persona crashing down. The image of the confident preacher, wrapped in luxury and certainty, could no longer survive the weight of evidence and testimony. What once looked like success rooted in faith was now clearly exposed as a structure built on deception, pressure, and repeated abuse of trust. The courtroom became the place where the contrast between appearance and reality was impossible to ignore. The wealth that had been celebrated as proof of divine favor was re-examined through a different lens, one that traced its origins not to belief or honest work, but to manipulation and fraud. Each conviction added clarity to a story that had unfolded over decades, connecting early financial crimes, the reinvention as a religious leader, and the exploitation of followers into a single, unbroken pattern. The verdict did not rewrite his past. It simply confirmed what had long been hidden beneath polished speeches and public displays. For many who once followed Whitehead, the outcome was painful. Trust had been given freely, sometimes at great personal cost, because it was wrapped in language of hope and spiritual growth. The collapse of his image forced a difficult reckoning, not only with one man's actions, but with the broader question of how easily faith can be confused with authority, and how quickly success can be mistaken for virtue. The lesson here is not about rejecting belief, but about understanding the importance of accountability, transparency, and humility in those who claim moral leadership. Whitehead's conviction stands as a reminder that charisma is not character, and that wealth is not evidence of righteousness. When religious figures equate faith with financial reward, they create a powerful illusion that can silence doubt and discourage questions. This case shows what happens when that illusion goes unchallenged for too long. Eventually, reality asserts itself, often leaving harm in its wake. As this story comes to a close, it invites reflection rather than celebration. It asks listeners to look beyond appearances, to question narratives that feel too perfect, and to protect their trust with discernment. The fall of the Bling Bishop is not just the end of one man's rise and fall, but a warning about the dangers of surrendering judgment in exchange for promises of prosperity. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and reflect on its meaning. If you found this deep dive insightful and want to continue exploring stories that reveal truth beneath the surface, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing thoughtful, well-researched stories to light.